You're sitting in a dimly lit room, watching as the interrogator brings in a simple rope. At first, you think this won't be so bad, until your arms are yanked behind your back, bound at the wrists, and the executioner attaches a rope and hoists you into the air. A sharp pain rips through your shoulders, but this is just the beginning. The moment your feet leave the ground, your shoulders begin to rip from their sockets until your joints give way and then snap. But as brutal as this sounds, it's far from the worst pain a human can experience. According to the pain scale crafted from scientific studies, even this horrific punishment only rates 65 points, while the most excruciating death imaginable is estimated at 140. Stick around to find out what could hit the maximum mark, but I warn you, viewer discretion is advised. The strappado. The strappado was one of the most common torture methods used during the Spanish Inquisition as a way of extracting confessions. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and they were suspended by a rope attached to their wrists. This alone caused excruciating shoulder pain, but the true suffering began when the torturers added weights to the victim's feet or suddenly dropped them. However, the torment doesn't stop there. If the victim refused to talk, the torturer might suddenly release the rope, only to pull it tight again, snapping tendons and tearing muscles apart. Some victims suffered permanent paralysis, while others passed out from sheer agony, only to be revived and subjected to another round of relentless torment. Moreover, the psychological trauma was equally severe. The anticipation of each drop was almost as torturous as the physical pain itself. What makes the strappado particularly disturbing is how simple and effective it was. It needed no complex equipment, just a rope and a pulley, making it accessible to torturers across the world for centuries. But because victims often passed out before experiencing the full extent of their suffering, this form of punishment only scores 65 points on the pain scale. But if you think being suspended in agony wasn't brutal enough, imagine molten lead dripping onto your exposed skin. That's the lead sprinkler, a deceptively simple device that inflicted unimaginable pain on its victim. The lead sprinkler. First, the torturer would carefully heat the small pieces of lead until they were scalding hot, before sprinkling them over the restrained victim's body. The pain was instantaneous and catastrophic. The burning liquid would instantly cause severe burns, blistering the skin and leaving permanent scars. But the true horror came from the lead itself. It hardened quickly, clung to the victim's skin, and caused even more damage when it was being removed. But what made this torture method particularly cruel was its precision. The torturer could target specific areas of your body, including the eyes, private parts, or open wounds from previous torture sessions. This allowed them to inflict maximum pain without killing the victim too quickly. However, because most victims lost sensation as their nerves were destroyed, it ranks at only 72 points on the pain scale. Now, the Inquisitors weren't the only ones who mastered the art of slow, agonizing death. Across Asia, an equally horrifying method also emerged: the pit of snakes. Dating back to ancient times and used across multiple civilizations, the concept was simple. Dig a deep pit, fill it with venomous or constrictor snakes, and lower the victim into it. And then, the hissing begins. But what made this torture so effective was the psychological terror it induced. Even before feeling the first bite, victims would often break down from fear alone. The species of snakes used varied by region. In some cases, non-venomous snakes were used solely for psychological impact, but in others, a mix of venomous and non-venomous snakes created a terrifying uncertainty. You never knew which bite might be lethal. But here's the thing though, while some victims were bitten immediately and had their veins flooded with venom that caused paralysis, internal bleeding, and agonizing muscle contractions, others suffered a much slower fate. They were left to starve, dehydrate, or lose their sanity as the pit slowly became their tomb. This torture ranks at 84 on the pain scale, not only because of the sheer agony inflicted by the venom, but because of the prolonged suffering of those who were trapped in the pit. The slow, creeping death, where every second was a descent into starvation, madness, and despair, amplified the torment far beyond the initial pain of a snake bite. Yet even this agony pales in comparison to those who were sentenced to the tiger bench. The tiger bench. Unlike medieval torture devices, the tiger bench is a chilling example of how cruelty evolved into modern times. Used in 20th century China, particularly against political prisoners, this method wasn't just about instant agony. It was about slow, deliberate destruction. The victim was forced onto a long wooden bench, their legs stretched straight and bound tightly. At first, this might only seem like an uncomfortable sitting position, but one by one, bricks were placed under the prisoner's feet, forcing their legs to bend slightly upward. As more bricks are added, the pressure on the leg muscles, tendons, and joints becomes unbearable. What makes this torture particularly effective is that it targets the body's largest muscle groups. As the legs are forced upward, the quadriceps experience extreme tension, leading to muscle tears, ligament damage, and eventually complete dislocation of the knee joints. The pain wasn't just unbearable, it was inescapable, allowing torturers to extract information over extended periods. Some victims were left in this position for days, unable to move, eat, or even relieve themselves. Their legs swelled to great proportions, and even if they survived, they were often often permanently crippled. The worst part? It wasn't just the pain, it was the slow, inescapable descent into hopelessness. Victims weren't just tortured, they were left to dwell in their suffering, hour after agonizing hour, knowing there was no escape. The inability to shift even an inch as the pressure built, the swelling worsened, and their bodies betrayed them made this pain unbearable. For these reasons, the Tiger Bench earned 99 points on the pain scale. Pressing, death by crushing weight. But let's move on to the next method. Pressing, also known as peine forte et dure, a form of torture that slowly and relentlessly crushed its victims under its unbearable weight. The method was straightforward. The victim was laid flat on their back, arms and legs stretched out and bound. Then, heavy stones or weights would be gradually added to the board. At first, it only made breathing difficult, but as the weight increased, the chest cavity collapsed, making each breath more shallow and excruciating. The rib cage would begin to fracture, pressing inward on the lungs, making every inhale a battle against the impending suffocation. For some, death was swift, occurring within minutes if the weight was heavy enough. However, in many cases, executioners dragged out the torment, adding weights gradually, forcing the victim to suffer for hours or even days before finally succumbing to asphyxiation or cardiac arrest. One of the most infamous cases of pressing was Giles Corey, a victim of the Salem witch trials in 1692. Accused of witchcraft, Corey refused to enter a plea, knowing that doing so would lead to his family losing their inheritance. The authorities resorted to stacking heavy stones onto his frail body, but each time they asked for his plea, Corey's response was, more weight. Sadly, his torture lasted for 3 excruciating days before he finally died. The prolonged agony, paired with the psychological torment of knowing the next stone could be the last, explains why pressing earned 93 points on the pain scale. With that in mind, let's move on to the first device to go above 100 on our list, the spiked chair. At first glance, the spiked chair appeared almost ordinary, but upon closer inspection, its terrifying reality became clear. The seat, backrest, armrests, and even the footrest were covered in sharp iron spikes. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. The spikes weren't designed to kill, at least not immediately. Their purpose was far worse. They inflicted constant, unbearable pain while keeping the victim conscious and aware of every second of their torment. The victim was stripped bare and forced to sit on the chair. Then, leather straps or iron bars were used to bind them tightly in place, ensuring that every movement drove the spikes deeper into their flesh. Once secured, the real suffering began. The sheer pain of the spikes piercing the skin was horrific enough, but there was no relief. To make matters worse, any attempt to shift position or struggle only worsened the agony. Every flinch, every breath sent fresh waves of pain searing through the body. But torturers weren't content with pain alone. To intensify the suffering, some spiked chairs were made of metal and could be heated with fire or had hot coals placed underneath. As the chair grew hotter, the spikes burned into the victim's flesh, combining pain with unbearable heat. Or some designs had mechanisms that allowed the victim to be pressed deeper into the spikes. With no way to find relief and no position that offered even a moment's respite, it's no surprise that the spiked chair earned a staggering 105 points on the pain scale. But as brutal as fire and metal spikes are, they are still far from the most painful punishments we'll be covering today. Bamboo torture. In parts of Asia, particularly during ancient times, torturers took advantage of one of nature's fastest-growing plants to create an unimaginably cruel method of execution, the bamboo. The executioners would begin by tying the victim down over a patch of young bamboo shoots. The person would then be stretched out, immobilized, and left exposed to the elements. At first, the scene may have seemed almost peaceful, lying on their back, staring up at the sky, but beneath them, the real nightmare was beginning. Here's why. Bamboo is known for its incredible strength and growth rate. Within hours, the sharp, spear-like tips of the bamboo stalks would start pushing against the victim's skin. Over the course of several days, the unrelenting bamboo would pierce through the flesh, slowly burrow into muscle, organs, and eventually emerge from the other side. This process could take days, with the victim fully conscious for most of it. The slow, relentless nature of this torture made it particularly horrifying. There was no escape, just the knowledge that each hour brought more pain as the bamboo continued to grow, leading to the victim's death and a justified 109 point on the pain scale. But what if I told you that there was something similar, but way more claustrophobic? The iron coffin. The iron coffin was not just any torture design, it was a punishment designed to destroy a person's soul before their body even gave out. Once a victim was forced inside, the heavy iron door would be slammed shut and bolted from the outside. At first, it was just the feeling of cold steel brushing against their skin, a terrifying warning of what lay ahead. But soon, reality set in. Since the walls of the coffin were lined with sharp metal spikes, even the smallest twitch, the faintest breath, or a shift in weight would push the spikes deeper into their flesh. Some victims tried to stand perfectly still, but no one could stay frozen forever. Their legs would cramp, their bodies would weaken, and eventually their muscles would give out, forcing them to slump and drive the jagged spikes deeper into their own bodies. Unlike quick executions, this was a death by inches. The spikes didn't pierce any vital organs immediately. Instead, They sank into the arms, legs, back, and sides, ensuring a long, excruciating suffering. Victims would bleed out slowly, feeling their own warm blood trickle down their skin, while the iron coffin became a chamber of silent, inescapable agony. In some instances, executioners would shake or tip the coffin, just enough to force the spikes deeper into the victim's body. The screams would be muffled by the iron, but those outside could hear the sickening squelch of flesh being torn apart. Due to the sheer horror of its design and the excruciating pain it inflicted, the iron coffin earned 110 points on the pain scale, but is still not as brutal as this next one. Sawed in half, this execution method, used across Europe and Asia, is exactly what it sounds like, and even more horrific than you might imagine. The victim would be hung upside down, often between two boards, with their legs spread apart. Starting from the groin, executioners would slowly saw through the body, working their way down toward the head. Because the victim was inverted, blood would rush to their upper body, keeping them conscious for much of the ordeal. What made this method particularly cruel was its deliberate slowness. The sawing could take hours, with the victim fully aware of what was happening. By starting at the groin, the executioners ensured that vital organs were damaged last, which prolonged the victim's suffering. Some victims were sawed only halfway through before being left to bleed out, while others were cleaved entirely in two, with their remains being displayed as a warning to others. It's no surprise that this method is considered one of the most agonizing forms of execution, ranking at 125 out of 140 on the pain scale. As horrific as this was, the next form of punishment was by far the most feared and gruesome of them all, the blood eagle. The blood eagle wasn't just an execution, it was a gruesome spectacle meant to send a message of terror. Originating from the Vikings, this horrifying practice was reserved for the worst traitors. The process begins with the victim being restrained, usually face down and completely helpless. The executioner, often a skilled warrior, would then take a sharp blade and carve open the victim's back, slicing deep through the flesh and muscle until the rib cage is exposed. But that is only the beginning. With unrelenting precision, the ribs are then severed from the spine and pried to resemble a set of wings. This alone sent waves of unimaginable agony through the victim's body. With the ribs spread apart, the lungs are pulled out and draped over the victim's back, creating the illusion of a blood eagle in flight. Some stories claim that salt was rubbed into the wounds to ensure that even as their body failed, their nerves continued to burn, bringing the pain scale to 135. Historians debate whether the blood eagle was ever truly practiced or if it was exaggerated Viking propaganda meant to terrify their enemies. However, the sheer detail in Norse accounts suggests that even if it wasn't common, the belief in such a punishment was enough to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dared to cross the wrong people. If you liked this video, subscribe for similar ones, or comment below to suggest another.